Shalom and welcome to Temple Talk. This is Yitzhak Ruben speaking to you from Jerusalem, Israel. Today is the 29th day of the month of Tishrei, 5782. It's the 5th of October, 2021. Tonight begins a two-day Rosh Chodesh, announcing and celebrating the new month of Marcheshvan. Tonight is actually the 30th day of Tishrei, but when there's a two-day Rosh Chodesh, it begins with the 30th day of the concluding month, and the second day of Rosh Chodesh is the first day of the new month. This coming Shabbat, we read the second Parsha, the second Torah reading of the book of Genesis, the second Torah reading of the new cycle of Torah readings of 5782, Parshat Noach. Of course, Noach, known in other languages simply as Noah, without the chet at the end, just the soft Noah. Of course, he's the man that built the ark. He's the man that saved humanity. Noach, and we're going to be talking about Noach very soon. First, let's talk a little bit about the month of Marcheshvan, also known as Cheshvan, but the longer name is Marcheshvan. There's a few different explanations for why it's Marcheshvan, and that is that one, the word mar means bitter. So some say it's Marcheshvan because there's no holidays in the month of Cheshvan, and so it's a little bit bitter to the taste because there's no holidays. Of course, we've just concluded a month chock full of holidays, that month of Tishrei, which began with Rosh Hashanah and included Yom Kippur and Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret / Simchat Torah. So for many of us, we can use this little pause in holidays to sort of get back on schedule and to return to our daily lives. So it's not so bitter for everyone, but it's true that it is the only month, I believe, in the Hebrew calendar that doesn't have a holiday in it, although that has changed, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. The other explanation for Marcheshvan is that Mar also means Mr., as in Mr. Smith would be Mar Smith. So Mr. Smith means it's formal. Mr. Cheshvan means it's formal. It's sort of a formal month because there is nothing in particular to celebrate. Although it was the month that the building of the first Holy Temple, built by King Solomon, using the building plans that his father, King David, wrote up with the prophet Samuel. It's the month that the construction of the Holy Temple was actually completed, although it wasn't dedicated until the following Tishrei. And we talked about that or learned about it on our Facebook page perhaps just a few weeks ago, because King Solomon postponed the dedication of the completion of the Holy Temple to the Tishrei that followed its completion in Cheshvan, and then had a big celebration, a 14-day celebration, which concluded with the conclusion of I believe it concluded with Shmini Atzeret, which means there's a question there because it included the day of Yom Kippur, and what was there a celebration on Yom Kippur? What exactly happened? It's not clear, but I just have to say that the month of Cheshvan is an important month in the annals of the Holy Temple because it was the month in which the first Holy Temple was completed. Another ray of light in the month of Marcheshvan occurs on the 29th of the month, actually the final day of the month of Marcheshvan, and that is an old new holiday. I've talked about it before, and I'll be talking about it more in the upcoming weeks as we get closer to the holiday of Sigd. You can spell that S-I-G-D, Sigd, which is an old Ge'ez word. Ge'ez is an ancient Semitic language. It's the father language of the modern Amharic language, Ethiopian language. It's the official national language of Ethiopia. And Sigd is a festival, a holiday that is held on the 50th day following Yom Kippur, which falls out on the 29th of Marcheshvan. And it was a day that began with fasting, very intense prayer. People would the entire villages would take treks up to a mountaintop, a local mountaintop, let's say, and they would face the direction of Jerusalem and say prayers, longing for the return to Jerusalem, return to the land of Israel, and the Holy Temple. And again, Jerusalem became the byword. It became the word for Israel, for the temple. Jerusalem. The word Jerusalem meant everything. It embodied all these different aspects of the return to Israel for Ethiopian Jewry throughout the centuries. It's not exactly clear, at least I don't have a clear understanding of when the holiday first began, what its initial history was, but it became a very important holiday, which began, as I said, began with fasting, and at a certain point during the day, a number of cattle and sheep would be slaughtered, and the fast day would turn into a feast day. And with much prayer, with reading from the Torah. And the word Sigd is related to an Aramaic word, sagad, let's say, which means to bow down in worship. In fact, the Hebrew word for mosque is masjid, which is a house of worship, a house of bowing down. And the word mosque, you can see the word mosque, the English word mosque, is an English pronunciation of Arabic word, which basically means the same thing. And the word sagidna, sagid, whatever, comes up in Aramaic tefillot, Aramaic prayers, and part of our liturgy. Sigd, it's on the 29th, and since the great return, ingathering of Ethiopian Jewry, which has taken place over the past number of decades, actually began in trickles early in the 20th century, trickles by just a handful of Ethiopian Jews who came to Jerusalem, and later after the establishment of the state, but it began in earnest really in the 1980s and 90s through today. And so the holiday of Sigd has been transported to Israel, and it's been declared, made officially a nationally recognized holiday. And it can be celebrated anywhere in Israel, but its main focal point is in Jerusalem, and on a tayelet, an open promenade in Armon HaNatziv, which is a neighborhood of Israel, of Jerusalem, which is south of the Temple Mount, and in fact it's in a high spot, and from that area you see the Temple Mount, which I imagine is a main reason for that being the chosen place of the venue. It's a large open outdoor area, and many people, certainly many Israeli Ethiopians, gather there on Sigd, as well as many non-Ethiopian Israelis, and more non-Ethiopian Israelis, I think, are joining in the celebrations each year. Last year, of course, it was very seriously curtailed because of the corona. This year, hopefully, it'll be open, and it's a very beautiful celebration. Begins with a lot of tefillot, a lot of prayer, led by Kesim. Kesim were the Kohanim, really the priests of the Ethiopian communities in Ethiopia, Jewish communities. Kohen, is the Hebrew word for priest, temple priest. Now these weren't priests; these weren't descendants of Aaron, so they're not genealogically. They're not Kohanim today. They were called Kohanim or Kesim in Ethiopia, but they were the spiritual leaders, and they lead the prayer. Very, very beautiful ceremony on Sigd when the day arrives, and at a certain point the prayers are concluded, and it just becomes a very happy gathering, get together from people from all around the country. Again, I'll have more to say about it as we get closer to that date, but I bring it up now because it really is, I think, it pierces that image of, or even the reality of Cheshvan as being a month without holidays. And I think it's very significant because it's a holiday that's been now incorporated into our calendar because of the ingathering of the nation of Israel, the ingathering of the tribes. And so it's a sign, it's a portent, it's a sign of the Geula, of the redemption, which has begun, and it's a process. And part of that process is I believe, is this introduction to the general public of Israel, to Klal Yisrael, to the entire Jewish community, of this holiday, which we can all take part in and celebrate, and we don't have to bemoan the month of Marcheshvan as being a month without a single holiday, because now it has a single holiday. I think that's very significant. This coming Shabbat, we read the second portion of the book of Genesis, Noach. And of course, everybody knows the story of Noach, Noah, the man who built the ark, the man who saved humanity from the flood. Before we talk about Noach, I want to speak a little bit more about last week's Parsha, Bereshit, in the beginning. We talked last week at length about Adam, about the concept of loneliness, of being alone. It's not good, and the concept that there was all of a sudden in this beautiful creation, which was good and good and good and very good, all of a sudden there's this not good. And what's that not good? It's loneliness. It's being alone. It's being disconnected. It's being not having someone to relate to, someone to extend beyond yourself in order to relate to, whether it's another human being or God. And that's sort of where we ended up because we ran out of time. In fact, I remember I went over a few minutes because I really wanted to speak about that and complete my thought. But right after God created woman in order to bring man out of his shell, to give man a partner, and then the two of them would engage with Hashem. And of course, the whole story of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and of the serpent in the tree, and they ate from the tree, and then they discovered, they realized they were naked. They had nothing to conceal. They were exposed. They no longer were naive. They no longer were innocent. They had eaten from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, of being able to discern between good and evil, to be able to have to weigh things and make decisions. All of a sudden they're adults, right? They're not innocent children anymore, and that frightened them, so they hid. So as we know, God's voice, a beautiful concept, a beautiful imagery, God's voice was walking in the garden, and he said, Ayeka. He said to man, Ayeka, a single word in Hebrew, which means, where are you? Where are you, man? I think that's one of the most important questions, one of the most significant moments in the history of mankind, even though it happened right at the beginning. Where are you? It's a question that we have to ask ourselves always. Where am I? What am I doing? Where am I? And so man says, I'm hiding. I'm ashamed. I'm afraid. I'm naked. And God understood, of course, right away what had happened. And he said, you ate from the fruit that I told you not to eat from. Now, we could talk about this for a long time. Was it a setup? It just seems like, did God really think that man wasn't going to eat from the fruit when he said, don't eat from the fruit? We know you tell a child not to do something, and you've just whetted their appetite. So perhaps it was God's plan all along that man should break his own innocence, should leave his own innocence by disobeying what God said. Maybe that was the plan. But in any case, that's what happened. And so man changed the entire dynamic between man and God with this act. So afterwards, God ejected Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. He made for them ketonet or, a clothing of leather or skin, right? Or in Hebrew means skin. He gave them skin. He made them not naked anymore. He clothed them. He made them physical, some say. That till this point they were at such a high level, they were spiritual. They weren't fully manifested in the flesh. And so they were spiritual. But now they gave them a covering of skin. In fact, in Hebrew, the word for skin, or, is ayin vav resh. The word for light is aleph vav resh. And the pronunciation is practically the same, or and or. And so some of our sages say that they had previously had their covering was light. They were light beings of light, because they were such a high spiritual purity. And now they've descended into the physical. So they've been given these new garments of actual flesh. In any case, the story tells us that God sent them out of Eden. You cannot stay in the Garden of Eden anymore because of what you've done. Now, I look at it a little bit differently. I think that it was man who, by eating from the fruit, he himself changed his reality. He caused himself to be ejected. He basically ejected himself, and he sort of said to God, I don't need to be in the Garden of Eden. I want to be on my own. Like I ate from the fruit. I'm independent. I don't have to listen to you. I can go my own way. So God said, fine, go your own way. It's going to be painful. It's going to be painful to have children. It's going to be painful to plow the earth in order to raise anything for you to eat. You're going to be eating from the, from the thorns and the thistles. It's not going to be easy. That's what you want. A child grows up. I want to be on my own. I want to be independent. Fine. You go. See what it's like out there. In the meantime, we know that right after that, we're told that God sets angels, kruvim, cherubim, in front of the tree of life with that flaming sword that was spinning flaming sword to protect the way to the tree of life. That is to guard it so that man could someday return. Not to keep man away from it because man might eat from it. No, to guard it in order to protect the way. And these kruvim in Hebrew, cherubim in English, they are the angels, angelic beings that are protecting this tree of life. What's the tree of life? What are we referred to as the tree of life in Judaism? The Torah. Where was the Torah received? Mount Sinai. Where was the Torah placed? Into the Ark of the Covenant. Where was the Ark of the Covenant placed? In the Holy of Holies, in the Holy Temple. And what was on top of the Ark of the Covenant that guarded over the Ark of the Covenant? The kruvim, the cherubim. So the path back to the Garden of Eden, the path back to this intimate relationship that we had or could have had with Hashem before we blew it, is the Torah and is the Holy Temple. That's the way back, and it's been guarded so that we can return. And that's the whole odyssey of humanity. Ever since the ejection, ever since leaving the Garden of Eden, is to get back. That brings us to Noach. And the first verse of Parshat Noach, and it's called Parshat Noach because it's one of the first words in the first verse of the Parsha, begins with chapter 6, and it is verse 9. I'll read it again, first in Hebrew, then in English. Ele tolodot Noach. Noach ish tzadik ta'amim haya b'dorotav. Et Elohim it'alech Noach. These are the generations of Noach. Noach was a righteous man, perfect in his generations. Noach walked with God, And then it tells us that Noach had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japhet. Shem, Ham, and Japhet. Okay. Noach, he was a righteous man. He walked with Hashem, perfect in his generations. He is given great PR here. He was righteous. He was tamim, perfect, unblemished, and he walked with God. Now, Adam hid from God. So now 10 generations later, and this is 10 generations later, we have Noach who he's walking with God. This is a huge change. Now, he happened to be the only one of that generation that was walking with God, the only one of that generation that was considered righteous. And in fact, when it says righteous in his generation, some of our sages say, well, he wasn't as righteous as Abraham, who was righteous, for every generation. Compared to everybody else, Noach was a righteous man. I think Noach, you can say that, you can say that Abraham was more righteous, and we'll mention him in a minute, although we're going to wait till next week when we introduce to Abraham in the Torah. But we're going to mention this point because even if we want to say that Abraham was more righteous, you have to say Noach was a very righteous man. And from a man, Adam, who hid, to a man who was walking with Hashem, who, right at the end of last week's parsha, it says, we learn about the birth of Noach. And his father was Lamech. This is in chapter 5, verse 28. Lamech lived 122 years and begot a son. And he called his name Noach, saying, this one will bring us rest. The word Noach means rest or comfort. This one will bring us rest from our work and from the toil of our hands, from the ground which Hashem had cursed, right? Hashem cursed the land. He said to man, you're going to have to work hard, the sweat of your brow to make bread, right? For your basic necessities. You're going to have to work hard. It's going to be painful and tiring. And his father, upon his birth, said of Noach that he's going to relieve humanity of the curse. And then we read a little bit later on in verse 1 of chapter 6, and it came to pass when man began to increase upon the face of the ground, and the daughters were born to them, the sons of the rulers. The sons of the rulers is how it's translated here. What do we say? That sons of the rulers is B'nei Elohim, right? The sons of God. This translation says ruler. Sons of gods, literally, saw that the daughters of man were good, and they took themselves wives from whoever they chose. And Hashem said, my spirit shall not contend evermore concerning man, since he is but flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim. Who were the Nephilim? There were some giants or something, we're not sure. Unknown entities were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, where the sons of the rulers would consort with the daughters of men, sons of Elohim, of God, would consort with the daughters of men, were bare to them. They were the mighty who from old were men of devastation. So something very odd is happening on earth. There's much legend about it. There's much midrash about it. There's much conjecture about it. I don't think that anybody really can put their finger on exactly what was going on, although many people, I'm sure, feel they can. Hashem saw the wickedness of man was great upon the earth, and that every product of the thoughts of his heart was but evil always. And Hashem reconsidered having made man on earth, and he had heartfelt sadness. And Hashem said, I shall blot out man, whom I created from the face of the ground, from man to animal, to creeping things and the birds in the sky, for I have reconsidered my having made them. God is regretting having created man. Wow. But Noach found grace in the eyes of Hashem. Another beautiful thing to point out here is that the word grace in Hebrew is a translation of the Hebrew word chen, which means grace. Chen actually is Noach spelled backwards. So it's a very beautiful little play on words, if you were. Noach found chen, grace in God's eyes. First of all, wow, the concept that God could regret having created man, that man was so blemished and so corrupt that God said, my bad, I'm going to wipe him out. But Noach, matzachen be'enei Hashem, he found grace in God's eyes. If it wasn't for Noach, what would it have been? Or you could say, well, yeah, if it wasn't for Noach, then Hashem wouldn't have made that dramatic decision, because it would have really been the end of man. You can look at it either way. But Noach was the one shining light in this whole generation of corrupt people, where there was no regard one for the other, where the actual one of the words is Hamas, right? You know, Hamas is a terror group. It's also an ancient Hebrew word which means total disregard for another person's integrity, for their property, for their physical being or their spiritual. It's just total iniquity. And that's what was happening. And of course, this whole description of the sons of God, or sons of angels, and the Nephilim, it's very, very, very mysterious. It's very fascinating. But something bad was going on, and Noach was the hope. I just want to mention, because we've skipped over all these generations. In fact, we skipped over the story of Cain and Abel. And again, one of those, after Cain, seemingly out of jealousy or just out of despair or a lack of self-worth, because he felt so rejected, he kills his brother. And that's when God comes and says, "Where's your brother? Where's your brother Abel?" Hevel in Hebrew. Hevel actually means breath, or sometimes it's translated as vanity, because it's breath. It's sort of nothingness. So it's very fascinating that Hevel, whose name meant breath, would be the first human being to be murdered, and he has no descendants. There's nobody today who is a descendant of Abel, because he was murdered by his brother. So of course God says to Cain, "Where's your brother?" And that's of course where Cain, or in Hebrew Cain, says, "Am I my brother's keeper? I'm supposed to be responsible for another person? I didn't know that. I didn't know that being a human being and being a brother involves responsibility and care and concern and kindness toward one another and empathy toward one another, and that you can't just strike out and kill another human being because we're all brothers." He didn't understand that. How could he understand? What experience? What did he know? He was first generation. He was the first human being besides his brother to have a brother. So of course it's a horrible, tragic statement about mankind, but it's there nonetheless. It's there from the very first generation. It's something that man has had to contend with, and of course God dealt very harshly with Cain. But I want to just speak about one other individual in this line of generations between Adam and Noach, and that is Enoch. In Hebrew, Chanoch. Chanoch means Chanoch is from the word to teach or to dedicate. It's a very beautiful word. It's a name that is still in use today here in Israel. And he was the great-grandfather of Noach. Chanoch. It's not spelled the same, but he was the great-grandfather. And of course, of him we're told that of Chanoch we are told that, let me just find the verse. Okay, Chanoch, we are told, Chanoch lived, in chapter 5, verse 21, Chanoch lived 65 years and begot Methuselah. right? He was the oldest man ever to live. Chanoch walked with God for 300 years after begetting Methuselah, and he begot sons and daughters. All of the days of Chanoch were 365 years, and Chanoch walked with God. Then he was no more, for God had taken him. So there's two things that I want to point out about Chanoch. You're probably already anticipating. One is that he walked with God, something that also Noach did, and something that Avraham is told that he walked before Hashem. But also that he walked with God ve'eneno, he was no more. So he's an exception to the rule of the description of all the generations, and then doesn't talk about his death. He walked with Hashem and he was no longer. So, of course, ancient legend arose that he was transformed into an angelic being. And that he, to this day, has a high position in the angelic family, court, as it were, of Hashem. And there's a whole literature, ancient literature about the angelic hierarchies and courts and their different roles, and it's very fascinating. And there is a book called the Book of Sefer Chanoch, and it was written probably about 300 BCE, meaning early Second Temple time. It was written originally Hebrew and maybe Hebrew and Aramaic, and the original Hebrew or Aramaic or both does not exist anymore. It was translated into a few other languages, including Gez, the language I mentioned earlier, ancient Semitic language, and the book of Enoch was sort of rediscovered by a Scottish explorer named James Bruce in the 19th century. He was in Ethiopia, and he brought a copy back of the Gez, had it translated into English, Book of Chanoch, Book of Enoch. And it describes Enoch's transformation into an angel, and it talks also about the Nephilim. It's a very fantastic book, the descriptions. There's a modern translation of it back into Hebrew. And it is a book that the story of Enoch Chanoch is a story that's known to Jews and to Christians and to Muslims, and each religion has its own lessons to take from a Chanoch and its own interpretation and understanding. But he's a fascinating figure of which we know very little. There is an ancient understanding that he was the first human being to develop a calendar, and the remez, the hint for that, is in the fact that he lived for 365 years, a solar year in days, and that's a hint that he developed a solar calendar. And back in ancient times, calendars, they still do have intense, tremendous significance, because for religious purpose, for agricultural purposes, for everything. And so to develop a calendar was a very, very, very powerful thing. It was, you were inspired. You were not an average person. So that's Chanoch. Running out of time once again. Getting back to Noach, we're going to again segue his story, I guess, into the next week's parsha next week, because here's the music, and we're finished for today. But so much to talk about. Again, tonight and tomorrow night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, Thursday, Rosh Chodesh, Marcheshvan, Chodesh Tov. Everybody have a good month. Thank you for being with me. Temple Talk.